Hello, howdy, and welcome to the MMA Vivisection, where we break down in detail an entire UFC event. Well, not always UFC, but an entire event of MMA action before it's even dead. But this is not Halloween time. In fact, the next holiday around the corner is New Year's. New Year's is all about new beginnings, and to that effect, we have the return of Ronda Rousey highlighting the event, which we'll be discussing today. I'm talking, of course, about UFC 207. But before we get into that, let's introduce your hosts. I am Connor Ruebusch, taking over for Zane Simon on today's installment of the Vivisection. And replacing Connor Ruebusch is Phil Mackenzie. Phil, how are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad.
Good to have you. Thank you for joining me. We've got a relatively brief 10-fight card to break down here, maybe adjusted for the fact that it is happening on Friday, December 30th, rather than on the 31st on New Year's Eve. But let's get started with the prelims. We'll try to run through most of these prelims pretty briefly. The only one that I think deserves extra attention maybe is the first one, the Fight Pass prelim, the only Fight Pass prelim. This is a welterweight clash between Alex Oliveira and Tim Means. Phil, I'm going to let you take it first.
Okay, so, and yeah, I've just got to apologize to everyone that, you know, we don't have regular, appearance from Zane here. I will do my best to fill his Titanic shoes. You know, we all know that he's the kind of beating heart of all the vivisections. So I think we'll do our best to kind of respect him by, you know, making fun of him for not being here.
Yeah. You got to like say yeah a lot. Say that being said.
Yeah. And world war size.
Yeah, definitely. And get more angry with me. You seem way too genial right now. You need to be more frustrated, Phil. So what do you think? Oliveira versus Means.
Great fight. Should be barn burner from start to finish. With Alex Oliveira, it's very difficult to kind of keep a track of how good he is technically. I think because it's very difficult to separate that out from how gifted he is. He's hugely tough. He's pretty big, although he's no longer a massive and weight class missing lightweight. But you know, he's got this
he's
fantastic
still pretty big
sense
for a welterweight.
Yeah. I mean, like, he's one of these guys, just he's a little, I'd say a little bigger than the other cowboy, and they just have huge, perfect frames for jumping between weight classes, kind of just big and rangy. And I think, and what we've kind of seen from him is that he tends to utilize that kind of rangy frame more in the clinch than he does as a striker, although he's got a very nice kind of backstepping right hand counter that he lands. And I don't know if that spells good things against Tim Means, who is another huge rangy ex-lightweight who is probably much better served at welterweight. Because I think in general this is essentially a matchup of technique versus physicality. And to be honest, I'm a little concerned with this one because the last time that we saw that, it was Brooks versus Oliveira, and Oliveira came out on top.
Yeah.
But in general, I think kind of Means' ability to fight off the clinch, his ability to land kind of slapping elbows, short knees, he's a much more precise striker in close, I think. Unless Oliveira can really get some kind of situation where he can overpower, where he can just get tie-ups without getting cut open, I think it's going to be difficult for him to deal with someone who's comparably big and kind of just much more technically skilled, both as a range fighter and as a clinch fighter.
So you're going with Tim Means?
I think so. I don't think he can finish Oliveira, but it's again, it's very difficult to tell how it's so difficult to tell how good Alex Oliveira is.
Right, it's tough.
He did not look good against Cowboy, particularly.
No, but he looked pretty solid in his last two, and then he had a couple appearances a few years back where he was less than stellar, maybe looking overtrained, or it's tough to get a read on how really consistent he is as a fighter.
Yeah, you don't really know how much depth he has in his game and how much is just being covered by being enormous and tough and just
an athletic freak too.
freakishly strong. Yeah.
Yeah, with the timing and power and physical strength and everything, he's obviously very, very athletic. His size, his physique is not a facade. You know, it's definitely he fights the way he looks. At least sometimes. That is the thing. It's tricky to me. I think I would love to pick Tim Means here. I like Tim Means a lot. And when you talk about this as a striking engagement, he definitely, I think, has the edge there. He can be a little hittable, a little static with his head. But he's very aware, stays very calm, and extremely accurate, throws good combinations. Basically, you give Tim Means someone who can be picked apart but will throw back, and you end up with a fun fight, which Tim Means slowly gets more and more dominant in. But I'm not sure that we're going to see that kind of fight. And in fact, judging by what we've seen from Alex Oliveira and most of his good performances, I think we're going to see a lot of clinching and wrestling from Oliveira. And that is something that Means has struggled with in the past. It was a problem for him. The last time he fought someone near his size, actually a little bigger, was Neil Magny, who continually dragged him down, pinned him against the fence. Means was competitive, just as Will Brooks was competitive with Alex Oliveira, but that is the kind of engagement where size, strength really comes into play. Fortunately for Means, he's tall. He has his elbows, his knees. I think it'll be really interesting and tough no matter who comes out on top. But I do think Oliveira's going to prove stronger down the stretch. I've always been pretty impressed with his stamina. Despite his size, he seems to keep up an impressive pace for the duration of a 15-minute contest. So I'm going to go with Alex Oliveira by decision, which gives us our first split, and we're only one fight in. And so I'm not sure how clear the consensus will be today. But as for our betting odds, this fight, it feels pretty close, and the odds reflect that. Tim Means opened as a -140 favorite. He's now floating right around -111. And Alex Oliveira opened as a slight underdog at +100, and he is now also floating around -111. So the odds basically reflect that it is a pick'em fight, just kind of how it feels to me.
Yep, I think it's really an interesting one of like commitment versus efficiency as well, because it's going to be because Oliveira is that guy who throws everything into everything, and Tim Means is very much a guy who just wants to fight his little snipping Muay Thai fight where he just wants to cut little bits off you until there's none left. He does not want to go full bore clinch drag style like Oliveira has increasingly embraced.
Tim Means is one of those guys you'd love to see in a smaller promotion because it would mean he could be a champion or a contender with 5-round fights, and he would be fantastic with 5 rounds to attrit people and tear them apart bit by bit. But unfortunately, he's only got 3 rounds to work, so that makes this fight even a little more interesting. Next up, we have another welterweight matchup. A lot of welterweights on this undercard, in fact, all but one fight taking place in the 170-pound division. This one is between Brandon Thatch and newcomer Niko Price. Of course, apologies, I have some kind of post-Christmas cold taking over here. Brandon Thatch, of course, was super hyped coming into the UFC, seen as this really talented prospect, performed really competitively against Ben Henderson, and though there was a big size advantage for Thatch in that fight, he still came out of it looking pretty good, a little clueless on the ground, but he looked like someone whose athletic potential, whose striking ability, and whose size was going to carry him until he figured that ground game out. Cut to about a year and a half later, and we have the guy who is now on a 3-fight losing streak, on a serious skid. His last loss being to CR Bahadurzada, and while Bahadurzada looked very, very good in that matchup, looked like he had worked on a lot of the things that were troubling him during his own layoff, it is probably the worst loss so far of Brandon Thatch's career in terms of the ranking of his opponent. Bahadurzada does not stack up to Gunnar Nelson or Benson Henderson, not quite. So Brandon Thatch really, to me, is a guy who needs a win to maintain his spot in the UFC, and I think the UFC recognizes that, and that's why they're giving him this matchup. Niko Price is not a walkover in that he is tenacious. He tends to come forward and try to drag his opponents to the ground or just swings away with both hands. He will try to win, but he is just a little too sloppy. maybe a little too used to overwhelming his opponents. And while Thatch maybe had that problem too, he's been through the experience of learning that lesson. Niko Price has not yet had that experience. I think even if it's largely been negative experience in the UFC, that experience is still a valuable asset for Thatch. And then you add in the fact that he is, once again, the considerably bigger man, and just the more dangerous, more precise striker. I think I have to favor him by about a second round TKO. Feels about right to me. What about you, Phil?
Yeah, Brandon Thatch. That'll be our first World Weary sigh of the day.
mixed feelings for you. Well, that's truly celebrating Zane's absence. It's just a lot of World Weary sighing.
Yeah. Thatch looks kind of dismal against Bahadurzada. Not early.
He hurt CR sometimes early in the fight.
Yeah. He just kind of didn't look like he knew what to do as the fight progressed. And
kind of typical prospect problem. It looked like he ran out of ideas.
Yeah, he wore on Thatch. He wore on Bahadurzada early. Like he landed like a fair amount of kicks. He got I think a body lock takedown, a submission attempt, a whole bunch of clinch knees, like all this kind of stuff. But then there was a kind of point where Bahadurzada was just kind of doggedly plodding after him, and then Bahadurzada got it into his head to shoot takedowns, and that was kind of it. It was just, he never adapted to, he never seemed to kind of adapt to being able to stop CR's takedowns, who's never been like, maybe he's a much better takedown artist than I'm giving him credit for, but I don't consider CR Bahadurzada to be like a takedown machine.
Not a takedown machine. Can I give you some statistics from the fight actually that really backs up your point? Bahadurzada's numbers from rounds 1 through 3, he lands 26 strikes, then 34, then 24. Pretty consistent, nice spike in the second round. Here's how Brandon Thatch's numbers go. He lands 20 in round 1, 8 significant strikes in round 2, and only 2 in round 3.
Yeah.
So that's a bad fade. That is a pretty steep drop.
That is a I don't want to be here anymore. I am in full-blown survival mode fade.
Yeah.
And that is very, very concerning. Because, like you said, he should have this wrapped up if he's going up against Niko Price. I think probably the weakest part of Thatch's stand-up game is probably his hands, but he's still got, a nice counter hook. He's got a fantastic clinch game. He's a good kicker. He's got a decent guillotine and choke submissions. He's a good fighter. He should be a good fighter. He's huge.
That's why the losing streak is kind of such a shock. He's looked progressively worse against, again, no shade to Bahadurzada, but against progressively worse competition. But I do think the reason I have to pick Thatch is that Niko Price is once again a step down, and I think a pretty considerable one. Bahadurzada is really only the worst of those 3 losses by default because the other 2 guys were very good fighters. Price is really raw.
The one thing that Price has going for him is that he, as far as I can tell from, the limited tape that's out there, is that he has no concept of fear. Yeah. He just marches forward. He's like kind of like a Justin Gaethje without the offensive or the defensive technical polish of Justin Gaethje.
It's like Justin Gaethje without all the defense.
Yeah, exactly. which kind of, that's why we can't pick him. But the thing is, I'm really worried we're going to get some kind of Noke versus Morono type fight where Thatch loses just by not trying, because Niko Price is going to try super hard. He's going to be going balls to the wall the whole time. And I just don't know if I trust Thatch to do that. I mean, he's got so much offensive ability available to him, and Price is so open. I got to think that Price is going to get stopped. I'm going to say probably submitted. Sometime in the first round. I think he'll rush into the clinch and get kneed and maybe tapped out. But I don't trust Brandon Thatch at all anymore, and I would be very unsurprised to see him just get outwilled.
Yeah, Thatch is very, very close, if not already, in the lost battalion, what our friend Eugene Robinson would call a gicta. the guy that I can't trust anymore. It's a sad story, but I hope he gets back on track. Let's look at the odds for that one. Both of us picking Thatch with some trepidation. Nico Price opened as a very sizable underdog at plus 260. He's closed considerably down to plus 156. So it looks like very early when the lines first opened, some people who were also not trusting Brandon Thatch got in on that one. Thatch himself opened as a considerable favorite, minus 380. Now he's all the way down to minus 185. So that fight still Thatch favored fairly heavily, but it has closed up a lot since it opened, and probably for good reason. Let's move on now to our only non-welterweight fight of the preliminary card. This is, by the way, on Fox Sports 1, these prelims, whereas I forgot to mention, I think, that Alex Oliveira, Tim Means is the only Fight Pass prelim. These next four are all on Fox Sports 1 before we move over to the pay-per-view. This is a middleweight showdown. Antonio Carlos Jr. Shoeface taking on Marvin Vettori. Phil?
Middleweights. It's our favorite division.
It's perfect that you and I are here because there's one middleweight fight. It's the card for us.
It'll keep us on track. So, yeah, this is an interesting one because Shoeface was a guy who looked like he could have potentially gone down, the kind of Thatch, and as we'll get to in our next fight, Garcia route of kind of being an underwhelming prospect. But I was actually really impressed with his last win. Admittedly, Leleco is a fighter much like Nico Price in that he is simply trying to hit you, and he doesn't really have any nuance to his game at all. But I think Carlos Jr. still showed like a good, solid, like he just broke him down from a distance and then took him down when he got too close, and he never deviated from the game plan. He never got worried that his attacks weren't working. He just did, it was a nice, mature, developed performance.
It's kind of GSP-esque. It was nice and systematic.
Yeah. And that's exactly what you want to see after someone gets totally derailed by old, like janky Australian. Yeah, the dreaded Ladbroke Grove chip shop kick. So Marvin Vettori, on the other hand, again, another guy's pretty difficult to keep a handle on. He's obviously he's a pretty good grappler. He's at a good camp. I think he's still is he with Kings? I believe so. We'll
find out as we go. American top team for Shoeface.
Yep. I think Vettori is still a bit raw, and I think he's still a little bit on the athletic side, and I just don't think his game matches up well with Carlos Jr.'s. I think that we're talking, it's going to be a matchup I think Vettori has still shown himself to be a very wooden wrestler, a very wooden striker, and in terms of clinch wrestling, I'm unconvinced that he can. In terms of clinch wrestling, kind of top position grappling, I'm unconvinced that he can hang with Shoeface. I mean, when he beat Alberto Uda, who is a man possessed of one of those Nam Fan black belts, I think. When he beat him, like the grappling was started by Uda taking him down, like from the body lock, if I recall correctly. And I'm going to say that I think that Antonio Carlos Jr. might be a better offensive wrestler and top position grappler than Alberto Uda. It's a controversial statement, I know, but yeah. So I just think that Vettori he's a good talent. I think this will probably be a good learning experience for him, but I think the matchup's all wrong for him. Carlos Jr. I think can work from the outside and is just a better grappler.
Yeah, he is, by the way, at Kings MMA, and primarily it says on Tapology at a Stabile fight team, but I think he's probably training more at Kings these days, Marvin Vettori, coming over from Italy. Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you said here. This is one of those fights that I get kind of worried about because it seems like a pretty easy pick, and that's how I felt about Antonio Carlos Jr.'s his fight 2 fights ago against Dan Kelly, and look what happened. There are problems for me. Maybe the GSP comparison is apt because GSP 2, super athletic, great ground game, and long range striking from the beginning. Slightly different origins than Antonio Carlos Jr., but similar in that he also had some early career moments where it kind of seemed like his heart wasn't in it. And that's usually a very bad sign for a fighter, but he went on to be the greatest fighter of all time. So it's not something that bars your participation in the sport. And coming back with a good win, a good dominant win over Guimaraes, over Leleco, I think that's a pretty good performance. I agree that it was nice, systematic. It looked like someone getting back on track. A fighter like Leleco, yes, he's a little wild. He's a brawler by nature, but to me that makes him a good test for a fighter who needs to find his way. You know exactly what you're going to get out of Leleco, and you know he's going to be trying to find ways to finish you, even if you're dominating him. So to go in there and successfully dominate him, that's a good sign to me. And the reason it feels pretty simple is that to me, Vettori is just kind of a slightly less experienced, less developed version of Antonio Carlos Jr. You know, he's pretty big. Yeah. He's athletic, not quite as big as or as athletic as Shoeface. He's a good submission grappler, not quite as decorated as Shoeface. Everything is just slightly below. And so unless it comes down to heart and it turns out that Vettori does have more of that to draw from, technically speaking and physically speaking, it does seem like it's Antonio Carlos Jr.'s fight to lose. So I'm going to go with Shoeface by a second or third round submission. Although I would not be shocked if Vettori came in here and was just really gritty and tough and won enough scrambles to make Carlos lose his faith just a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think, heart is also something, it's one of those things that's a bit like aggression. I think you can teach heart to an extent. I think, there's extreme outliers, obviously, but a lot of the time it's just a kind of layering process. You just want to, you need to go out. People need to go out there and get in trouble in the gym, and then get out of it and think, okay, how did that go? Was that all right? Just do it again and again and again. I think a lot of it can be related back to work ethic. A lot of the time, if you're a really hard worker, you're generally going to do all right, just because you're going to have been in those situations. And I think Shoeface, he looked in his last fight like he'd really thought about, like, how do I just make sure if I'm in this kind of chaotic environment of the MMA cage and I'm fighting a guy who is chaos, how do I ensure that I put that in a box and I never get in trouble?
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of times, I think, for fighters, it's about just learning that it's okay if the worst thing happens, like being knocked out maybe in training or in a fight at some point, and then waking up and realizing I can go back to training. I'm okay. My career's not over. GSP, the one weird thing that GSP and Nate Diaz have in common is that they go into their fight saying, Nate says, I'm probably going to get knocked out, and then is pleasantly surprised when it doesn't happen. But GSP used to always say that he would make peace with the worst possible outcome. And that's an experience I think a lot of young athletic fighters need to learn, is that the worst could happen and it'll still be okay. So odds on that fight, let's see. Marvin Vettori, pretty close all the way. Opened as a +115 underdog. He's now up slightly to +122. Antonio Carlos Jr. opened at -155. He's down to -145. So not a lot of movement there. Seen as a fairly close fight, which I don't think is unfair. And Antonio Carlos Jr. justifiably favored. So with that, let's move on to our next fight, which is yet again in the welterweight division. This one between veteran Mike Pyle and aforementioned disappointing prospect Alex Garcia. This one's me, I think. Alex Garcia, I've gotten this feeling for his past few fights that he's not a very good fit for TriStar MMA. I don't know why that is, but I think that Frost as a hobby works really well with fighters who can sort of have a dialogue with him, who are not just, it's not like Rafael Cordero or let's say Greg Jackson with that kind of flexibility to work with anyone, or Rafael Cordero where it's just kind of you listen, you go through the fire, and you come out better. With Frost, it's kind of a back and forth. We're having a discussion about how you're going to get better. You understand the techniques the same way I understand them. It's a cerebral style of coaching and cornering, and I don't think Alex Garcia is a very cerebral fighter. Just judging by his fights, there's not a lot of adaptation that ever happens in his bouts, not a lot of on-the-fly adjustments, or even between rounds. It seems kind of difficult to get to him, to get him to listen and think tactically about a fight. And so he goes into a lot of bouts, looks pretty sharp in the first round because he is coming from a good camp and has made some developments, and then kind of devolves. I guess he's TriStar's Leonard Garcia in a way, except that he is also a phenomenal athlete.
Brutal.
Yeah, well, he's a phenomenal athlete with serious power, but
yeah,
it's like every time Greg Jackson would try to get Leonard Garcia to stay on his toes and not go wild, it would last for 4 minutes, and then he'd be back to the original Leonard Garcia. And Alex Garcia is kind of the same way.
I'm also just not sure if like the round winning process that they teach at TriStar is fit for someone who's, you know, obvious his physicality just makes him a burst fighter. He has to be a burst fighter, and that's just TriStar it's not a burst gym. Like,
yeah, it's all about putting together a victory from the ground up, and that Alex Garcia is a fighter who probably would be better off learning a style of fighting that is all about stealing big moments and how to set up those big moments and make them more reliable. And as it is now, it's like you get big moments in the first round, and then he's not quite sure how to make them happen again. So I actually think Mike Pyle is going to beat him. Mike Pyle consistently surprises me as a fighter. I know he's very old and very shop-worn at this point, 41 years old. He started way back in 1999, which is absolute insanity. He's been fighting for over 20 years at this point. Is that no, not quite 20 years, but close to 20 years at this point, 18 years. 17 years, something like that. A long, long time. Unbelievably long for an MMA career. And yes, every time he loses these days, he pretty much gets badly knocked out or hurt at some point in the fight. Even going way back to his fight with, let's say, Jake Ellenberger, he's been easier and easier to knock out. And that was back in 2010. So it hasn't gotten better for Mike Pyle, but he also hasn't completely fallen off in the way a lot of fighters do. He still kind of goes in there. If he gets knocked out, he gets knocked out. But sometimes he doesn't get knocked out, and he comes back and knocks you out or snatches a submission or wins an impressive decision. Mike Pyle's always in there trying to find an intelligent way to win the fight. Even if he's not a super technical fighter all the time, he has ideas of how to win. He's not just in there swinging and going crazy. He kind of walks you into traps. He sets you up. He figures out how to beat tough young opponents. I think in this case, Garcia, he's very likely to hit Pyle big in the first round. If it's the right kind of shot, he may very well knock him out. But as this fight goes on, I see Mike Pyle taking over his clinch game, his grappling, and his tricky striking is better with someone who doesn't throw as much, and that's Alex Garcia. I think Pyle will be in less danger than usual after that first round and will get himself a finish win. I'm going to say a submission.
Yeah, I can see it. I'm not gonna pick.
Not going to join me on that one.
No, but the thing is that, like, in some ways, we kind of saw a similar fight from Alex Garcia. You know, he was taking on the old scrappy vet when he fought Mike Swick, and that was not a terribly impressive win.
No.
And this is the problem with Garcia, is that I think the trying to build him up as this process fighter is kind of stripping him of his offensive capabilities a bit. Like, he just needs to be able to take the risk and just blow through guys a bit more.
It almost feels like Johnny Hendricks kind of losing his knockout touch, you know, like maybe not being as vicious as he needs to be a consistent winner.
Yeah, increasingly the only part of Garcia's game which is really working was the wrestling, and even that let him down pretty badly against Sean Strickland. So I can definitely see, like, Garcia comes out, he's maybe a bit too tense, a bit too kind of wound up to, you know, go for that big, you know, shot that would put Mike Pyle down. Instead, he tries to play it safe. He tries to out wrestle him. Maybe he picks up the first round. But the thing about Mike Pyle that we've seen with fights like, you know, Sean Spencer and so on, is that you really want to take him out in the first round. Like, if you don't take him out in the first round, he has a lot of incredibly crafty offensive tricks up his sleeve. He's kind of like the Juan Manuel Marquez of MMA, in that it's almost as if he needs to get hurt before he gets really dangerous. It's almost like it's
it's worse if you hurt him and don't finish him. Maybe the best way to beat Mike Pyle is to do what Colby Covington did and just safely beat him for 3 rounds. Because if you hurt him and you can't finish him, he kind of gets this lasered focus that becomes more difficult to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Pyle is the MMA is one of like the most infamous like gym heroes. One of the, you know, the guy who was, you know, one of the best guys in the world in the gym and never showed up on fight night. So I think that, you know, when he gets hit, it is exactly that kind of GSP Diaz thing that we were talking about. That he gets hit and he's like, all right, I got hit. All right, here we are. Now we're fighting.
Yeah.
Now it's time, you know, and he just settles into his groove. And then and the thing is, if Garcia doesn't take him out of that, again, much like Thatch and Price, I can just see him losing based on kind of just not wanting the fight enough to stop Pyle from doing what he wants to do. I'm still gonna pick Garcia just because there's been such a transparent path to victory for beating Pyle lately that I've got to assume that that TriStar are gonna be training Garcia specifically for that. I think that he maybe could win a decision anyway, just due to how that Pyle is looking increasingly slightly physically eroded and easy to take down. He could theoretically win a boring decision, but most likely I think he probably does catch that early shot on Pyle and put him down in the first round. I have very little confidence in it though, and I'll be very unsurprised if it turns out the way that you see it.
Yeah, if it does not go Mike Pyle's way, it could be a sad end of the year for old vets. First Bernard Hopkins getting knocked through the ropes, and it could be Mike Pyle taking what would probably be one of his worst losses yet, I would say, to a relatively unproven Alex Garcia. So we'll see. It could make all of us fans of old, dogged veterans a little sad, but let's turn to the betting odds.
But on that note, there's always Crow Cop King Mo.
Yes, there's always Crow Cop King Mo to keep us depressed. We've got
Mike. He won that though.
Did he?
Crow Cop knocked him out.
Oh my God! Did that happen?
Yeah, this morning.
I fell asleep before that point. I was just watching the early stuff, experiencing pride, nostalgia, and I went to bed. I was like, nothing good's going to happen. Crow Cop beat King Mo.
Yeah, he knocked him out like a left uppercut into a flurry. He stuffed a takedown, then he landed a left uppercut and then a flurry, and yeah, they waved it off.
Holy shit, that's awesome. All right, I feel good. I feel good.
So we got a Crow Cop Baruto in, I believe, which is just amazing.
Oh, Ryzen, you are the best. Mike Pyle opened at plus 140, not a ton of movement. He's now at plus 146, his average line, that is. Whereas Garcia opened at minus 180, he's down to minus 172. Personally, I don't feel like this one should be anywhere too far from minus plus 110 on either side. This feels like a pretty pick'em fight to me. I can definitely see either guy winning, but that's kind of why I don't think anyone should be strongly favored. But
the bad thing about Garcia's game in his last fight was that everything fell apart. That his, and quickly, and that's very worrying.
Yeah.
He got out wrestled badly. He got outstruck pretty badly as well.
That's the kind of scenario that Mike Pyle feeds on later in a fight. When everything starts to fall apart, Mike Pyle starts to get really, really dangerous. So Pyle may actually be worth a bet there. Let me look at the lines more closely, see if there are any props that might make
definitely
him.
By finish.
Yeah, I was thinking Pyle inside the distance. That's plus 252. I think that is actually worth a small bet.
Yeah.
That's not a bad one. Maybe even the straight odds on Pyle. You can get him up to plus 160 on some lines, which also is not bad. So let's see. That brings us to welterweight featured prelim. Johnny Hendricks, former welterweight champion. We've mentioned his name already. Kind of a disappointing run for him lately as well. Desperately trying to get back on track. Weight cutting still doesn't seem to be going well. He had sort of a worrying interview with the press before the event where he was sort of angrily challenging media members to try cutting weight, to tell them how hard it was, but was sort of slurring his words and seemed to have difficulty putting his thoughts together. So seems like yet another very difficult weight cut for the former champion. Yeah, which is not a great sign. He is taking on Neil Magny, who has had a couple of his own bumps in the road, but largely has been pretty stellar for the past couple of years, putting together a lot of impressive wins and a couple of losses to, you know, some of the best contenders in the division in Lorenz Larkin and Damian Maia. And I think it, too, was probably the best Lorenz Larkin we've seen to date. So Neil Magny still going strong, I would say. Johnny Hendricks trying to get his feet back on the path to title contention. I think this one is me.
I think it might be me, actually.
Maybe it is. Let's see.
Yeah.
We'll start with you, me. It is you. You take it away, Phil.
Yeah. So at what point, like, do you think it became like a plausible thing that you could look at these two fighting? You could be like, I think Neil Magny could beat Johnny Hendricks. Like, when do you think that would like change from like the realm of utter fantasy into something which could, you know, like, and I'm assuming he's the favorite as well.
I'll check for you. He is. Neil Magny's favored very slightly.
I mean, yeah, Neil Magny is one of my favorite welterweights in division, just because he's one of these guys that he's organically developed. You've seen him do it in real time. He clearly works his ass off. He is. And
you get to see him fight so frequently that you see the developments. Yeah. There's a really nice timeline of Neil Magny getting better as a fighter, because you get like 4 fights minimum every year where he's making small strides between each one.
Yeah. And he's just he's just really fun to watch. He's an underrated finisher. He's and he's incredible cardio, big frame for the division. And I do think he's going to beat Johnny Hendricks. And partially it's because of. Hello, Connor, you there? Well, I'll keep talking until Connor gets back. Partially it's because Hendricks. It's because what you mentioned. It's because Hendricks doesn't seem to have the same power. He hasn't really been hurting people really badly since, I'd say, the first since the Robbie Lawler fights, basically.
Yeah, I'm always worried about saying that a guy is getting too technical for his own good. But it may have happened with Johnny Hendricks. He became a much better striker and may have in the process become a less dangerous striker. And that may have had the unexpected result of kind of eroding his confidence, where maybe he doesn't feel like he can snatch victory just out of thin air the way he could during his run up to the title.
Yeah, I think he's finding it harder and harder to jump on opportunities when he sees them. I think because that's essentially one of the general processes of aging out as a fighter, is that your brain will stop you from getting into situations where it's going to get hurt. And I think that happens to pretty much everyone to some extent. You know, it's the classic kind of veteran guile is partially enabled by being just much more defensively aware, but the counter side of that is that you stop pulling the trigger. And that's kind of what Hendricks looks like lately. So, I mean, the thing is that Hendricks still has so many technical tools which could make this a rough night for Neil Magny. If he can punch his way into the clinch and hit like those short Dutch combinations into the leg kick, he can absolutely beat Neil Magny. If he can, set up his takedowns, he's still a fantastic wrestler. He can absolutely beat Neil Magny. But it's just the sheer disinterestedness that he's displayed in so much of his recent fights, or not even that, just the kind of the lack of, he just looks slightly confused as to what's going on in there. He's like, where am I? Like, who am I? What do I need to be doing here?
He kind of looks like he doesn't want to be there.
Yeah. And Magny always wants to be there. And if you don't get him out of there in the first round, and it's pretty easy to hurt him there in the first round, unfortunately. He's got all these kind of, Magny is an increasingly effective kind of clinch wrestler. He has this horrible, like, evil habit of kind of sticking, he's a tall guy, but he manages to get he does a great job of using his head pressure underneath the other guy's head in order to like stretch him out into these, stretch them out into these horrible positions so he can pick up the body lock takedown. He's got a nice jab, although his footwork isn't quite good enough to kind of save him from getting countered when he throws it. But it's just the fact that he's always there. He's going to be fighting for 3 rounds, and I just can't trust Johnny Hendricks anymore.
Yeah, so you're going with going with Neil Magny?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Neil Magny by decision. Hendricks has still been tough. Magny always takes people out. Pretty much always takes people out on the floor. He always gets that kind of stacked, like high ground and pound. That's pretty much how he finishes the majority of his wins. And I still think it'll be tough to do that. Hendricks is still very difficult to keep. It's still difficult to keep on the floor. It's difficult to out wrestle in any way.
5 rounds, I could see Neil Magny finishing Johnny Hendricks, but with just 3, I think Hendricks' chin should still hold together. I want to touch on what you just said about Neil Magny's takedown game. I think he's not as good at fighting long as I think anyone wants him to be. He's too easy to back into the fence, too easy to counter, as you said, because of his footwork and his head position when he throws those straight punches. Almost a little too tentative about throwing the jab in the first place. I think Neil Magny would have a much easier time dictating fights if he would just double or triple the amount of jabs he throws, jab to the chest, keep his opponent at range. Instead, there's a lot of sort of pawing and reaching with the left hand, trying to line up the right and then walk into the clinch. So that makes him first round, one of many fights in this card where we're kind of asking, does one guy get a quick finish or does the other guy survive and outlast him? But as far as outlasting goes, I do think Neil Magny can compete with Johnny Hendricks in the wrestling because while he's not great at fighting long, he's very effective at fighting tall. And one of the ways he does that is in the clinch. As you said, Phil, there's kind of a natural leverage advantage for takedown attempts for the tall guy. Because if he's 6 or more inches taller than you, he really just has to get his arms under your armpits, and standing up straight will take your feet off the ground. There's a lot of natural leverage there for him where once he gets under you, he can lift higher than you can physically go and off balance you. And he did that really effectively against Kelvin Gastelum, as well as numerous others. He's ripped these guys off their feet. And then on the ground, great top position, really killer from half guard, not a super dangerous striker really, but very attritive, very tight top control, and some solid submission skills as well. Johnny Hendricks, he could put together those Dutch combinations and everything, get a win. But to me, the Johnny Hendricks that would be most likely to win here is really the pre-GSP Johnny Hendricks. I think the Johnny Hendricks who comes in aggressive and really just tries to bomb this tall guy over the top with a left hand, the one who knocked out Martin Kampmann, that's the kind of stuff that troubles Neil Magny most. It's just an aggressive fighter who gets in his face and hits him before he can figure out what's going on. But I'm not confident that Johnny Hendricks is going to show up. We haven't seen him in some time, and it seems more likely that he's just going to kind of slowly get worse and worse. So unless Johnny really can pull it out and turn in a sterling performance, I have to go with Neil Magny too. And I think a decision is probably the most likely result. Odds for that fight. Neil Magny is favored, as we said before. He started as a more slight favorite, -110. He's now up to about -126. So people getting in on that while they can. Johnny Hendricks opened as a -130 favorite. He's now down to official underdog status, +104. So the fight started as a pick'em as far as betting odds are concerned and became slowly more divisive with time. I think that's fair. I think Neil Magny has enough momentum and Johnny Hendricks has enough negative momentum to justify making the former champion a slight underdog, sad as it may be. But that ends our preliminary card on Fox Sports 1, which means we move over to the pay-per-view. Again, just a reminder, this fight is happening. This event is taking place on Friday, December 30th, not Saturday. Very unusual for a UFC pay-per-view, but on Friday, the pay-per-view card begins with a flyweight bout, Louis Smolka versus Ray Borg. And this is sort of a deceptively difficult fight to call, although maybe it should be a deceptively easy fight to call. It feels harder to pick Louis Smolka just because of what happened in his last fight. He was on an absolute tear in the division, 4 straight wins, impressive performances over guys like Ben Nguyen and Neil Seery, some solid wins in this division. And then Brandon Moreno, top flyweight prospect, champion in another organization, impressive on the Ultimate Fighter, everything. Shouldn't feel like a terrible win, but he was short notice and a huge underdog and managed to snatch a guillotine victory in just 2 minutes. Not something you expect to happen with Smolka, who has really made his name in the last couple of years by being a dominant grappler, a submission specialist. And I think maybe my hope is that it was a good thing that happened to Smolka, because I think he was getting a little too aggressive for his own good with his grappling game. And it did seem to be this sort of fearless come forward attitude that led to that loss to Moreno, where he was in a bad position, he scrambled free and didn't really reestablish position or make sure he was safe. He went right for a counter takedown, walked right into a guillotine. He was too scrambly for his own good, too willing to just kind of let the fight go where it wanted to go.
Yeah, there was that time. There was that time for like a month where doing reshot guillotines into getting doing reshots into getting off a scramble and getting instantly tapped out was just like the new hotness. It was like Pettis against
Oliveira.
Pettis against Oliveira. Didn't Oliveira then do exactly the same thing against what's his face? Flyweight Ricardo Lamas.
Something similar, yeah.
Really
Lamas did it to Oliveira, actually. Same exact thing. That's sort of a setup. Counter guillotine.
And exactly. It was all these guys being like, "I'm the grappler here. I'm going to grapple you." Like, oh, and
same thing happened with Efren Escudero and Drew Dober. We see a lot of these like reshot takedowns happening very quickly into fights where people they're too confident in their grappling dominance on the ground. I think that's probably a good thing for Smolka. My hope, at least, is that it teaches him a valuable lesson about being a little more systematic, a little more careful, not necessarily cautious, but just a little more, process-driven on the ground. And that could help him against Ray Borg. But this is one of the other guys in the division that probably could grapple fairly competitively with Smolka. Borg is a submission grappling specialist. A lot of his wins have come by submissions, many of them rear naked chokes. Very systematic on the ground, but also a guy who sort of thrives in scrambles and transitions. So Smolka will need to lock him down in order to beat him. We'll need to get him stuck in certain phases, certain positions. The thing that worries me here is that Borg has apparently gone to Jackson's MMA. He's working with Brandon Gibson now. He's talked a lot about how much work he's put in on his striking. And he was already obviously a guy with a lot of natural talent in all areas, very athletic. And if he can, in the space of about half a year, make a serious stride as a striker, it might give him the edge he needs to dictate where this fight goes, when it goes to the ground, and pick apart Smolka, who's never really been an amazing striker despite his build. Has always been, yes, creative, yes, flowy, but also kind of hittable and awkward. So that gives Borg a chance. I do think that Smolka will come in refocused, look consistently for the takedowns, and try to trap Borg in a bottom position where his favorite transitions and scrambles are not open to him. But if Smolka did not learn the proper lesson, or if Borg has made serious strides in his striking in a short amount of time, then it could be Smolka's fight to lose. So I'm going with Louis Smolka by, I'll say decision, but it could be a surprise.
I am going to go the other way. I'm not sure of how many people are going to be following me on this one, but I'm actually going to pick Borg. I think I was also the only person, at least in the staff picks, I think I was the only person to pick against Borg when he fought Scoggins. And I think, and the fundamental reason why was that I thought that Scoggins could essentially sit on the outside, kind of had just a huge kind of volume kicking advantage on a relatively stocky and honestly pretty mediocre striker in Borg, and could probably handle himself on the ground. And I thought that Scoggins had probably been tapped out enough times that he wasn't going to make any silly mistakes. Admittedly, he's still obviously hasn't gotten that out of his system. But
still another guillotine choke by the way. Pedro Munoz in Scoggins' last fight.
I think he sat up into that one, if I recall correctly.
Get caught on that goddamn guillotine. They should just ban it. It should be banned from the sport altogether. It's too tricky for these guys who just want to scramble, damn it.
So, the thing about Smolka is that I really enjoy both these guys' fights. This should be an absolutely fantastic fight. I think it goes without saying, but I'm not sure how much I trust Smolka to be the better wrestler here. He is a good wrestler, but the guys he's been out wrestling are not who I'd consider to be like upper echelon, like MMA wrestlers. We've got Richie Vasulik, Neil Siri. If I recall correctly, he started off losing the grappling exchanges to Paddy Holohan before he just started. Before he realized, hey, I'm 5 times more athletic than this thin Irish ghost. I can just scramble out of everything and crush him. So I think other than that, these guys are really similar. They're just, I don't think either, like you said, I don't think either of them are particularly great strikers. I think the difference between their striking and their grappling for both of them is so large that I just expect it to be a grappling match. Yeah. And I think Borg is the more reliable takedown threat. I think that means a lot when it comes to scrambling. Less so if we're talking flyweights. Admittedly, this is the division where being the guy who starts the takedown probably matters the least. But I do think it matters. And I think that Borg has been able to compete in the grappling. Both these guys have competed in the grappling with some pretty strong guys. But I just think the ability to initiate and probably the ability to stop the takedowns, because I don't trust Smolka's ability to stop the takedowns when he doesn't want to go to the ground. And I don't think that's something which has been tested in his recent fights.
Smolka's takedown numbers, looking at Fight Metric, have actually been kind of crazily lopsided. And I expected to find some kind of thing where it's like, oh, when he can't get the takedowns, he loses. But he got taken down by Alptekinos Kilic 9 times while scoring no takedowns of his own, still won the fight. Taken down twice while scoring just 1 of his own and lost to Chris Cariaso. Then he gets 6 takedowns against Neil Siri and wins. Gets taken down 4 times with no takedowns of his own by Paddy Holohan, still wins, and then has all the takedowns against Ben Nguyen. It's hard to figure out how wrestling really affects you in this division. But in a game of inches with 2 guys who need to grapple to win, better wrestling may be the deciding factor.
Yeah, although admittedly, I think Borg did manage to hit takedowns on Scoggins, and he got soundly out scrambled by him. But I think he may have been a little. My theory is that he may have been a little brain fried at that point. I think he'd already been pieced up a bit on the feet and was overcommitting. He
got touched up pretty badly by Scoggins throughout that fight. So another split for us on the 2 analyst ballots here. Let's take a look at the odds. Ray Borg is the slight favorite. He is favored, started at plus 100. He's now up to minus 136. So some people have jumped on that, maybe not trusting Smolka after that loss. Smolka started as the favorite, minus 140, but he's now to underdog status, plus 113. So there may be some value there if you agree with me and you think Smolka is still the fighter with more momentum and more upside. But to me, it feels like a pick'em fight, and I probably wouldn't really bet on it.
Nope.
Maybe you could bet on the total. Over 2.5 rounds, minus 225. Under 2.5, plus 195. Nothing really stands out there.
They both take too many risks. It's just going to be all over the place.
Definitely.
Especially, camp change. It's just loaded with X factors.
But scrambly flyweight grappling matchup, I'm always excited to see that. So it should be a lot of fun. Next up, second pay-per-view fight. We'll try to run through this one fairly quickly because the top 3 are really the ones we want to invest most of our time in. This one is, again, at welterweight. Dong Hyun Kim makes his return after a bit of a layoff against Tarek Saffiedine, who has been surprisingly active in the past 12 months after having a lot of layoffs of his own. Is this you or me? God damn, Phil, I can't keep it straight.
I think it's me.
It's you. How do you know so well? But it is. Dong Hyun Kim versus Tarek Saffiedine. It's all you, Phil.
Yeah. Okay. So Saffiedine has been active in terms of how he's been in terms of how often he's been fighting, his fights have been less. They have not overwhelmed. I think in my worry with Saffiedine is that the injuries have caught up with him.
Mm-hmm.
Is that he's now a technically gifted, like he's still a technically gifted fighter with the remnants of what was at once some pretty solid athleticism, and that in general I don't think he's really been a fighter who's only sporadically been able to access his potential, because he's another one of these guys who people in the gym were like, oh my god, this guy, is why he's the sponge, he picks up everything. And his ability to hurt people seems to be diminishing, and his own ability to get hurt seems to be going up.
Yeah.
And for a kind of classy technician, that just makes him too fragile, too breakable. Dong Hyun Kim, on the other hand, I don't know what to think of him anymore. I don't know whether he's just bonus hunting, or whether he's had some decent wins where he's shown he's like the Berkman and Waters fights totally. He did what he should. He got the takedown. He beat them up. It's good to see. I don't want to see him. I honestly don't want to see, whether he wins or loses, I don't want to see Dong Hyun Kim going out there throwing spinning back elbows and just kind of flailing all over the shop.
For his own good, you don't want to see it. But as a fan, it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun when Crazy Kim shows up.
I just feel like he could be he's one of these guys where it's just like, you could be so much better than this. But then, he's at this point, he is a veteran. He's probably not going to contend again. He's, I guess maybe he might as well be chasing bonuses. But I do think his ability, he does have something that he wants to do now, and that is clinch and wrestle. And given how effectively Rick Story was able to kind of pressure and bully Tarek Saffiedine, and how just bizarrely unable Tarek Saffiedine was to get him off him. He kicked him in the head like 500 times. And
as someone who wasn't Rick Story, their mind might have been changed by how many times Tarek Saffiedine kicked them in the face.
But Donald Cerrone then went on to knock him out. I just worry that that Saffiedine's offensive abilities have gone down. His durability's gone down as well, and I just think that if Kim doesn't have one of his performances where he's just lost his mind, I think he knows that he just has to push into the clinch and kind of wear on Saffiedine. So I'm going to pick Kim by. The thing is, Kim isn't very good at closing distance, though.
Right.
Do I really want to pick him to close distance against someone with footwork? He just runs at people. I'm going to pick Kim by decision.
You're going with Kim by decision. It's a tough one to call. It's Tarek Saffiedine. You know what you're going to get, but it's a little less trustworthy than it used to be. He comes in, he tries to fight the same fight every time, but he's maybe losing his ability to do so. Dong Hyun Kim comes in and fights one of two fights. Crazy, shit-eating wild man, swinging with both fists balled up. That's one option. And then there's sort of tentative pot-shotting, looking for a way to somehow get into the clinch. Less focused, but much safer. I think the shit-eating wild man could work against Tarek Saffiedine. Overwhelming him, coming after him crazily, that might work. Then again, coming forward in straight lines and swinging with these really obvious punches could also mean that Saffiedine's footwork, jabs, leg kicks will carry him and allow him to outmaneuver and pick Dong Hyun Kim apart. And I do trust Saffiedine to have the better stamina of the two. So that could go either way. Then you have Kim being safer. And again, he's already got some room for error because Saffiedine's not a great finisher. But if he's being safer, does he then accidentally consign himself to a long-range kickboxing match with Tarek Saffiedine, which is a fight I think he would lose? Basically, if Kim cannot find a way to get this to the clinch and on the ground, he's probably going to get picked apart for a good period of time, and he may not survive those head kicks the way Rick Story did. I've long been a a not so secret supporter of Rick Story and everything that he does. And I do think he's a very solid fighter. He put in a really good performance against Saffiedine, and I'm not sure that Kim really has the technical depth to replicate it. I'm not sure that he can go in there, take as many shots without losing his head, without getting crazy, cut off the cage, throw combinations to the body, and wear Saffiedine down. I think it's going to be either too wild or too tentative for his approach to the fight. So I like Saffiedine by decision. I think he will pick Kim apart, maybe have a tough first round, but I like the more technical, cautious fighter to win this one.
And I love Saffiedine, by the way. I really like. He's just such a kind of clean, technical. Fights from both. Like he's this mirror image of himself. He fights exactly the same, going both ways. And I just love like this kind of patient, technical, attritional style. I mean, I think it's great that he's with TriStar now. I think it's a crying shame that he never got with them earlier in his career, because I think he's exactly that kind of idealized he fits exactly with that kind of idealized, process driven kind of style that they like so much. I think. And
unlike Alex Garcia, he really does seem like he seems like a kind of guy who wants to engage intellectually with the process of fighting. He wants to understand it and go out there. He fights like somebody who has a scientific view of fist fighting. And so he's kind of like a hardcore fight fan's favorite type of fighter, because he's very scientific and thoughtful in everything that he does. But it is worth pointing out again that the physical body may not be able to keep up with what the mind wants to do anymore. So we'll see come Friday the odds on that fight. Saffiedine is the underdog to Dong Hyun Kim, and actually started that way at plus 105. He's now up to about plus 120 with some variation in the lines there. And Dong Hyun Kim is favored, started at minus 145. Now he's at minus 143. So not a ton of movement. Most people trust Kim more than Saffiedine, which I guess makes a certain kind of sense. It's in a what have you done for me lately kind of way, because Kim is riding a 2-win streak and Saffiedine is 1-2 in his last 3, coming in off a loss. So we will see, but I'm a little surprised to see Kim as a decent-sized favorite there. Next up, we've got a bantamweight matchup, and this is where the really good fights start. Former bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw is fighting fan favorite and top bantamweight contender. Well, I say bantamweight with air quotes around it, John Lineker. If Lineker can make weight, then he will probably be gifted a title shot with a win in this fight. Likewise for Dillashaw, and more confident in that one because Dillashaw has never had any issues making the weight. And this one should be, it could be about any one of 4 different kinds of barn burner. But either way, when John Lineker shows up to fight, you know exactly what he's going to do. He is the crystallization, the perfect crystallization of that Leleco mindset that we talked about earlier, where his only goal is to put his hands on you. His only goal is to go in there and find some way to hurt you. And he is blessed with a certain kind of fearless aura that sets him apart from most other fighters who do that, where he really seems unhurtable, unscarable. There's nothing you can do that changes John Lineker's mind or makes his body unable to do what he sets out to do from the start. And that makes him a pretty scary guy to fight. I've even kind of been appreciating recently how John Lineker seems almost buoyed by his opponents hitting him, because when they hit him, he knows he's close enough to hit them back. And every time, whether you hit or you miss or you get blocked, if John Lineker knows that you have just about hit him, he's going to respond with 3 or 4 strikes of his own, usually mixing up to the head and the body. A lot of hooks, not a lot of straight shots once he starts throwing, but just absolutely fearless, power in both hands, and pretty intelligent in how he places his shots. So John Lineker, he's a known quantity, but no one yet at bantamweight has figured out really how to solve it. The closest was John Dodson, who did have an argument for winning that fight, and was probably the first time I'd ever been really, really thrilled by something John Dodson did, because he fought Lineker extremely intelligently, stuck to his game plan for 5 rounds straight, and even that wasn't quite good enough. So Lineker, tough nut to crack. TJ Dillashaw may be the first guy in this division who is smart enough to crack it. In some ways, I think this is a bad matchup for Dillashaw, just because he is used to teaching opponents lessons with his counter strikes. He's used to sort of being able to swim in the fight as it changes organically. And Lineker's fights don't change. They start at a fast pace and it goes for as many rounds as it's scheduled for. But I do think that Dillashaw has a lot more technical variation in what he can do, whether it's his kicks, his wrestling, fighting really well out of both stances, his boxing, his movement. Everything kind of comes together and makes him a pretty difficult fighter for a static, feet planted sort of puncher to deal with. And while Lineker is a different breed from most fighters of that type, Dillashaw has had some of his best performances when fighters are more static and he can kind of maneuver around them, whether it's Rafael Assunção, who's fairly flat-footed and waits on counters, something that Lineker sometimes does, or it's Renan Barão, who plants his feet and starts swinging wildly when you come in at him, something else that Lineker does. Dillashaw has consistently shown that he can have a dicey first round and then just put together a really smart, intelligent fight throughout the remaining rounds and figure out how to beat those guys. So it'll be different than those guys. Lineker's not going to back down. He's not going to change his tone. Dillashaw will need to be extremely sharp, but I do think that Dillashaw is also a dangerous striker in his own right. He has his wrestling to fall back on, and he's never struck me as a guy who loses his head as the fight goes on. In fact, he typically starts a little too aggressive and then refines his fighting style as the rounds go by. So I like TJ Dillashaw by decision. Wouldn't be surprised if John Lineker won. All I'm hoping for is a good fight, and I think it'll deliver.
Yeah, I think this is definitely kind of this is the action fight of the card. I think you could maybe make an argument for Smolka Borg, but I think just in terms of sheer violence potential, this is just off the charts. And so I'm not sure that I think Lineker is a bad matchup for. I'm not sure that I think Lineker is a bad matchup for Dillashaw, because, as you mentioned, I think it's because I don't think that Dillashaw is, and I think the style that we saw Dodson use against Lineker was effective, but I don't, despite the footwork and the movement, I don't think we're actually going to see that from as much from Dillashaw. I think what we see from Dillashaw is countering the counter, and I think what he can really do to try and get that out of Lineker is to feint at him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he is masterful at that.
Yeah.
And as soon as Lineker commits to that kind of thing, that is where TJ Dillashaw shines. Because I think I think we kind of agree. We all sort of saw the same thing when there was the kind of idea of Cruz versus Dillashaw as being this kind of mirror match, and in many ways they're not the same kind of fighter at all. They just have the same. They just sort of move with their feet in similar ways. Mm-hmm. But Dillashaw is a mid-range he's a mid-range pocket technician, and Cruz is a long-range outfighter. I would expect Cruz to fight Lineker like he did. Like Dodson did, only with more takedowns.
Whereas
and so on.
Dodson, once Lineker started throwing, his goal was to get out of dodge. Maybe Dillashaw's goal will be to get Lineker to start throwing and then pay him back before taking an angle and resetting.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, so I think he can get Lineker. I think Dillashaw's job for me is to get Lineker to throw in the middle of the ring, into the middle of the cage. It's to get Lineker to start throwing punches before Dillashaw's back to the fence. He needs to get that response to him out in the center of the cage, and then immediately, counter with the strikes, or potentially with the takedown. I mean, I think actually Cruz was Dillashaw's really tough matchup, because he was so used to being so much faster than everyone.
And Dillashaw was very likely Cruz's toughest matchup in the division, which is why I desperately want to see that fight again, because it was one of the best technical fights we've ever seen.
Yeah. And I mean, the main thing that Dillashaw doesn't have going for him is he doesn't have Dodson's nuclear power. And Dodson did manage to hurt Lineker a few times. He managed to close his eye, and he was, I think he was probably on his way to. Personally, I think he was actually on his way to knocking Lineker out in that fight. I think Lineker was actually starting to lose his ability to because he couldn't brace with the left hands when they were coming in. But I think so. That is the kind of. That's the X factor for me. But the other matchup, which I thought very impressed me a lot, and the one you just mentioned, was Assunção, because I think Assunção he would be tough he's tough, and he would be tough for the TJ who fought like Renan Barão, and because that TJ was someone who tried to draw the counter, then got into the pocket, and then just went ham. Like a lot of the fights against Barão were literally just they were technical, but a lot of it was just TJ buzzsawing him. And I thought if he tries to do that against Assunção, if he just decides I'm in range, it's go time, Assunção has a serious chance of countering him. But he fought an incredibly disciplined, patient, in-out fight. He didn't overstay his welcome in the pocket, and I think that prepares him very well for a fight with Lineker. A
lot of what you're talking about, hoping to see here, a lot of single shot counters, drawing out of Assunção's kicks, and a big difference. I mean, the Dillashaw who fought Barão did have a tough time with Assunção, because he fought Assunção just before his title shot against Barão and lost a contentious split decision, but ended up getting hurt pretty badly at one point with a counter right hand, and had some difficulty. Much more clear-cut decision the second time around. So I agree. I think Dillashaw's probably made the right adjustments, and if he can not allow Lineker to force him back, really just stay in the pocket, so Lineker thinks, all right, all I need to do is I'm close enough, I need to bite down and counter, and then get Lineker to counter something which isn't actually an attack, he can probably get the kind of fist fight he wants without being backed into the cage and having to make those sort of panic or split-second reactions that John Dodson had to make over and over again, and that most people have to make over and over again against Lineker. So I'm with you. Yeah. I think that's a pretty good read.
I think that's how you frustrate Lineker. I think you have to show him. You have to show him that like the cage doesn't belong to him.
Yeah, that's a great point. Odds on that fight, Dillashaw is favored. Started at -190. He's become a heavier favorite over time. He's now at -244. People have some faith in the former champion there. Lineker opened at +150. He's now all the way up to +200. He may, in fact, be worth a bet at those odds, because Lineker has huge power. He's very tenacious. He may find a way to win here. If Dillashaw, if he gets a little overconfident like he did in the second fight with Barão, and does think, okay, if his mindset changes from make him throw and then counter, and that becomes make him throw and then counter with 17 shots in a row, it could become a little too dangerous. So Lineker may be worth a little attention there, but I think they've probably favored the right man.
I mean, TJ is a natural. He's just a natural banger. Like, you can tell that just by looking at him. Despite all the footwork, he just loves to bang it out in the pocket.
But it's a testament to how smart he is and how intelligent his training has been with Dwayne Ludwig and the others at Elevation, that he's come into several fights and tempered that. Even if he gets a little too aggressive in the first round, he tends to end the fight with very intelligent, precise, thoughtful striking. So we'll hope to see that from TJ Dillashaw. And that brings us to our co-main event. The bantamweight title is on the line. Not the women's bantamweight title, but the men's bantamweight title, as Dominick Cruz, still triumphant after winning a close split decision over Dillashaw at the start of the year, makes his third appearance in a single calendar year, which is an achievement in and of itself, to defend the belt against Cody Garbrandt, who Uriah Faber certainly hopes will be the next big star for Team Alpha Male, although we in the MMA community may have a few more reservations about that as of yet. So Cruz versus Garbrandt, who do you think leaves on Friday with the belt, Phil?
Garbrandt is very difficult to get a read on. All that we can really say is that he is he has a massive gift for the game, and that he is physically just unbelievable, just a stunning athlete. And beyond that, it's very, very difficult to kind of predict how his progression curve is, because what we've seen from him has basically been his last fight was simultaneously impressive but not very illuminating. All that we really saw, we were reminded that he has enormous power and fantastic hand speed. And it's very difficult to know kind of what a great, what happens in the kind of time, because this is the time when a talent like Garbrandt is going to be developing at his fastest. This is a time when he's going to be the most motivated to develop quickly. You never know when you're going to get a kind of Jones, Shogun, or Dillashaw Barao performance out of someone that just suddenly comes out of nowhere and just knocks you over the head. So, and then we have Dominick Cruz, who is, greatest bantamweight of all time, and one of the best fighters of all time, one of the smartest fighters of all time.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to pick Cruz. You have to. I don't think there's there isn't enough for Garbrandt to pick him. I do think that Cruz does get occasionally slightly overplayed. I think a lot of his weaknesses, which are kind of built into his game. Hello? Hello? Are you back?
We're still going? We're still live. We're good.
Excellent. Yeah, so I was going to say you
were saying Cruz is overplayed?
A little bit. He is, the weaknesses which are still there, which were there in the past, are still there. He still has amazing footwork, but he sacrifices power for misdirection. He breaks the rules by destroying his own posture in order to make you walk in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
He has a kind of, you can kind of tell the way that he reads and builds a fight. It's not a very hierarchical structure that he builds. It's not a very hierarchical structure that he goes into fighting people with. Instead, he has this kind of big, flat, wide thing of options. And, if they do a right hand, you do this. If they do a jab, you step out to this side, you land. And all his options are kind of one-to-one. He doesn't really prioritize necessarily one single thing over the other.
It reminds me of Demetrius Johnson, where you can almost kind of see him figuring out how to beat his opponent over the course of every fight.
I think the difference is that is around kind of the weirdness of Cruz, because like I said, I don't think Cruz, if there's a kind of, an option which is like a step knee counter, or stepping, his favorite thing is when he, steps to the right outside of a jab and lands the kind of lead uppercut where he laces it under the arm. To me, I think these options, he kind of sees them all as being the same. Whereas some other fighters will, they'll assemble their kind of view of how another fighter acts based on, rules. Like Jose Aldo, for example. Jose Aldo will focus on 2 or 3 things that you're going to do, and he will literally ignore everything you're going to do, everything else. Yeah. Whereas Cruz is trying to use all these various huge amounts of options in order to build up a complete image of how you're going to act, so that he can use every counter, no matter how obscure, in every situation. And the problem with that is that sometimes you're going to be wrong, is that you can't pick up there's no way you can pick up all the information. And he does put himself in risky positions sometimes, that he does break, he breaks stance, he backs away on a straight line every now and again. He'll, he can be caught out of these little kind of crouches. Mostly when he leads.
He still leads with a strike and then ends up kind of standing up tall, feet squared in front of his opponent. Split moment before he realizes he needs to regain his stance and take an angle. Yeah, the openings that Uriah Faber capitalized on in their second fight, that Demetrius Johnson capitalized on, they are still there. I think they're getting a little better with time. Cruz is becoming a little more, adjusting his style a little more for each opponent that he faces, but the openings are still there.
Yeah, so I think basically the issues with Garbrandt is that he leans too much on his unbelievable. He leans too much on his speed and power to do the heavy lifting. He looks like he's increasingly becoming a bit of a counter fighter lately. He has a fantastic like left hook, and specifically a kind of a great like that laser fast 3-2 like hook right straight that he throws that he used to like
lunging lead right, and then like a shifting left hook that sneaks weirdly between your gloves.
Yeah, like so but he's not particularly great at cutting the cage. He's not. He's a better. One of the things I noticed when I rewatched the Almeida fight, he is leg kicking more. He's kicking to the leg and body more. So I'd be interested. One of the things I'm interested to see is if we see more of a who's the guy who fought Benavidez? Huge head.
Cejudo. Huge head.
Cejudo. Yeah.
Huge hair. Maybe more so than the head.
Yeah. If we see that kind of thing, if he just sits there and he just says, I'm just going to try and hem you in with leg and body kicks, and then I'm going to try and throw these kind of blistering 1-2s down the middle as soon as you try and back out.
Yeah.
And then Cruz, but I can't rely on him to do that. I can't believe there's nothing. He hasn't shown me that he can do that, so I can't pick him to do that.
Yeah.
And I think what we've seen from him is too limited. I think Cruz has probably game planned for what we've seen already. I think probably Cruz is going to do his thing of entering, angling off, then countering with the right or the takedown. And I think that's what as Cody attempts to blitz after him to catch him after Cruz comes in, I think Cruz just hits double legs. Whilst I'm sure whilst Cody's been an amazing defensive wrestler, I am very unconvinced that he's gonna his stance just doesn't. If he can block takedowns, if he can block counter takedowns from Dominick Cruz with his stance, then he is truly a freak.
He is truly amazing.
Yeah.
Dominick Cruz has made a career of being the guy who takes down all the people who don't usually get taken down. He was the first to take down TJ Dillashaw, and while he didn't get a lot done off of those takedowns, I think he scored 3 or 4 over the course of the fight against a guy who was never, and I think still has never been taken down by anyone else for more than a second. Cruz took him down several times. So I would not be surprised if Cruz's wrestling played a major factor here. But you are going with Dominick Cruz?
I think I'll... Again, I don't know how Garbrandt reacts under if things start going south. I don't know how Garbrandt's going to react. So
the worst adversity. Go on, sorry.
Yeah. I think we might get a late. No, I'm going to pick Cruz by decision. He's decisioned. He's just not much of a finisher. Right. Just put it like that.
Yeah, it is worth entertaining the idea that Cody Garbrandt maybe doesn't do that well under pressure. The worst, it's possible, and we can't really know because we've seen so little of him, both in terms of number of fights and fight time. Most of them end so quickly. But the worst adversity we've ever seen him cope with in the octagon was just not being able to knock out Henry Briones. Like, that was the worst. That was the most shocking thing he's ever dealt with. He dealt with that pretty nicely. But what happens when somebody actually starts picking him apart and hurting him and making him hesitate? Does he stop throwing? Does he miss and get countered and end up getting hurt because he's off balance? We don't know. So there is an opportunity there for Dominick Cruz to maybe get a late finish if Garbrandt does start to fall apart down the stretch. But in a weird way, there is more forgiveness for Garbrandt than there is for Cruz. Even as the much less experienced fighter, he is far and away the more dangerous puncher and can probably afford to take a lot of what Cruz dishes out if it means staying close enough to return fire. If he does bank on leg and body kicks in addition to his punches, he can win some early rounds here against Cruz, or at least put together the groundwork of a more comprehensive fight. But as you said, Phil, I haven't seen it yet. So until I see it, it's really hard to predict it happening. It would have to be Garbrandt coming in and kind of fighting the perfect fight, or getting really, really lucky in landing a big shot early. And the more likelier outcome is, the style matchup prevails. Dominick Cruz wins. I think in the end, it's kind of a classic, not to be too reductive about it, but it's kind of a classic boxer versus slugger fight. And at least 2/3 of the time, the boxer beats the slugger. And as far as slick outfighters go, you don't really get much better than Dominick Cruz in the world of MMA. So it is really the best boxer versus kind of an unknown slugger. So I have to favor Dominick Cruz, and I do think he may end up getting a late finish. The method picks are always kind of a wash anyway, so I'm just going to take a chance and say 4th or 5th round TKO on the ground, I think is totally possible if Dominick Cruz starts to really enforce his wrestling game late in the fight.
I mean, it's the classic, like the best example, I think, for what we're likely to see is something like Horiguchi, Mighty Mouse. You know,
sure,
obvious talent, the much bigger hitter, probably has some success early, and then it just slips away.
And like Horiguchi,
that's the most likely call.
Like Horiguchi, Garbrandt will likely go on to get some more good, impressive wins after this fight. It's too much too soon, I think, for a relatively young and still fairly raw fighter. The odds on that one, Dominick Cruz opened as a favorite. Lines have not moved very much. Minus 225 to start. He's now down to minus 218. Cody Garbrandt, underdog to the tune of plus 180. We had one sharp drop, but now he's back to plus 179. So really no change to speak of there. Is there any value in betting on this fight? Over 2.5 rounds is minus 215. I mean, if you really think Garbrandt gets a TKO and you want to put a chance bet on a plus 245 Garbrandt by finish, maybe, but it's Dominick Cruz we're talking about. To me, the odds are just too long on something like that happening to make a bet. Let's see. What's Cruz by decision? Let's see. Cruz inside the distance is plus 255. That's maybe an option. Cruz by decision is plus 130. So if you think it's a typical Cruz performance, that may be the best way to go. But we shall see on Friday night, which brings us to our main event, the return of Ronda Rousey. She has been out since about this time last year. She lost her bantamweight title to Holly Holm in a momentous upset at UFC 193 in Australia. She now makes a return, and the bantamweight division, the women's bantamweight division, has been pretty crazy in Ronda Rousey's absence. The title was not in Holly Holm's hands for long. Miesha Tate took the title from her in another big upset and then instantly lost the belt to Amanda Nunes at UFC 200. Nunes has really put together kind of a banner year to the point that if she beats Rousey, she might be in the conversation seriously for Fighter of the Year, beating Sarah McMahon, beating Miesha Tate to win the title. Beating Ronda Rousey is big no matter what has happened in her recent past or where her head is. So it's a big opportunity for Nunes. And Phil, I believe this is you, so I'll let you take it away.
Is it? Or was it? Didn't I start with? I think I started with. Did I start with
me? Why do I not know how this works? I'm clearly not cut out for this hosting gig. It's not something I can stay on top of. It is me. So let's see. Well, question marks about both women's ability to go the distance. I think that is where this fight should rightly start. All of the talk about stamina tends to fixate on Amanda Nunes, and for good reason, because she has been throughout her career consistently really a one-round fighter who has a great first round and then experiences a pretty sharp drop-off in activity. And 3 of her 4 career finishes all happened in the second or third round, usually after a strong first round. Some of her close calls, like the fight with Valentina Shevchenko, where if only Shevchenko were not so tentative about taking advantage of an opportunity, we might be talking about Shevchenko, getting a shot at the title or even holding the belt at this point, because she was very, very close to finishing Nunes in the third round of that bout when Nunes just had nothing left in the tank. But Amanda Nunes, for one round, is a very dangerous fighter, possibly the most consistently dangerous fighter in this division. You've got to be really tough to take Amanda Nunes' shots. I think I can confidently say, the hardest hitter at women's bantamweight, and not a crazy wild puncher either. She has, in fact, shown off a very technical, precise, sort of counter-punching oriented game in a lot of her recent fights, highlighted, of course, by the Miesha Tate win that got her the title, but also the fight with Sarah McMahon, the fight with Shayna Baszler, where she just kind of goes in there and just masterfully cuts these small angles, throws in these laser-sharp straight right hands, and picks her opponent apart. It's almost crazy that she still has such an issue with gassing, because even when she doesn't get a near finish in the first round and she's winning pretty comfortably, she still can't seem to muster the energy for a third round rally. So I don't know what the issues are. And those who were hoping that Nunes finally becoming a full-time professional fighter would fix the problems, they were sorely disappointed, because here we are now, like 1.5 years, 2 years in to the full-time Amanda Nunes career, and she's still kind of a sharper version of the same fighter. But Ronda Rousey, I'm not confident that Ronda Rousey is the kind of fighter who can capitalize on someone who gets tired after the first round. The only time we have seen Ronda Rousey go to the third round, for example, was against Miesha Tate. And while Tate had really nothing for her after that first round, other than the will to survive, Ronda didn't look amazing after the first round either in terms of her energy. She looked a little slower, and she was, and always is, a little too willing to brawl in the opening seconds of a bout. And then Holly Holm, yes, Ronda Rousey lost heart in that fight, and understandably so, being picked apart so badly. But she was also really, really tired going into the second round. By the end of the first, she was absolutely gassed. And so is it fair to say that Ronda Rousey can come in here, survive the first round, and then get a finish? Who knows? Or could it end up being a classic Rousey fight where Amanda Nunes gets too confident and just runs into an armbar? Because it's become too easy to forget, I think, after this long layoff and after the loss to Holm, just how dangerous Ronda Rousey is. With, she has the grappler's version of a puncher's chance, except instead of a 10%, it's like a 50% odds for her that if you give her the opening, she's going to get the finish with that armbar. So dicey, dangerous fight. I can definitely see Nunes walking into an early clinch and getting submitted. I can definitely see Rousey walking into punch after punch the way she did with Holly Holm. I think that's probably more likely. I'm not confident about Ronda Rousey's mental state right now. She's been all over the place with the things she's talked about. And is she going to return? Is she not going to return? Does she ever want to fight again? She's been all over the place. And Amanda Nunes is nowhere near as effective as Holly Holm over a potentially 5-round fight, but she's far more dangerous with a similar style in that one round. Walking into Holly Holm's punches for one round, you probably would not take that kind of punishment from Amanda Nunes and make it to the second frame. So I'm going to go with Amanda Nunes by either a first or a late second round TKO.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one that kind of speaks to some of the issues with the weight class in general, because you kind of have to ask yourself to an extent, is Amanda Nunes, like, is she a legit is she like a championship level fighter who has kind of just had to get her sea legs as a professional and has had to get with a good camp and is going to continue to kind of blossom into this kind of athletic specimen who's going to put some of these cardio issues behind her and so on? And or is she Eric Silva, and is women's bantamweight a division where you can become champion by being Eric Silva?
By being Eric Silva, which it probably is to an extent.
Yeah, I mean that's a kind of interesting question to ask.
Is Ronda Rousey Eric Silva?
Yeah, I mean, there are serious questions like to be asked about whether this kind of unique, weird style that Rousey used to win the belt and dominate for so long, whether it was unique and weird because a lot of the rest of MMA had kind of moved on beyond that kind of thing. I mean, but in general, I think I have to agree just in that Rousey is so defensively poor, in that she has to cross distance in order to win this fight. She has to cross distance, and she has to cross distance without getting just her head ripped off. And I struggle to see how she does that. I think she'll be less. I think whilst Nunes is a harder hitter than Holm, she has one disadvantage that Holm didn't, which is that she primarily uses a right hand. And Rousey's kind of pouring jab that she uses to get her way into the clinch, it actually works reasonably. She'll kind of raise her shoulder in order to catch overhands on it.
It was the one technique she developed where I was like, hey, Ronda Rousey's turning into a good striker, and it was the last technique she developed. It's just coming in behind a dipping jab.
Yeah. So it might be relatively difficult to hit her with kind of for Nunes to hit her with a cross in the same way that it was for Home. I'm not sure that that's going to make that much of a difference. I mean, she still ate a lot of right hooks. So the other thing that gives me pause for Nunes is that she's a weirdly slightly dysfunctional clinch fighter in that she's not a strong. The person who Nunes reminded me of, actually looking at footage, she increasingly reminds me of like a bootleg knockoff of Jose Aldo, specifically kind of the one that fought Frankie Edgar. The way she angles off, looks for the right hand, it's very. And similarly, she pushes off on the. She's disengages from the clinch at all times. There's a great breakdown, I think, by I think it's BJJ Scout, where he talks about how Nunes will try and kind of push and destroy her own posture in order to get out of clinches. She'll just try and shove away. And she won't focus on which could leave her in serious trouble if she's if she gets locked up with.
Of Holly Holm's success was how specifically she prepared her reactions for the very specific kind of attacks that Ronda Rousey likes to go for in the clinch. And Faraz Zahabi did a great breakdown after that fight, talking about how she very specifically tried to keep Rousey from getting her arm across her body and tried to maintain posture, so she was relatively safe. But it's something that not every fighter could go in there. We've seen a lot of fighters who go in against Rousey having drilled their armbar defense or whatever at whatever stage of defense, and it still doesn't work. So,
yeah. But so I think Rousey's just so open to counters. Nunes hits so hard. Her footwork is increasingly actually pretty damn good. She's a good leg kicker. I think she can, if she needs to initiate from a distance, if she doesn't want to, if Ronda decides somehow she wants Nunes to lead, I think Nunes will pretty much just kick her. I think that'll be pretty hard I think she'll just kick her she'll just leg kick her. I think that'll be relatively different. Ronda doesn't really have the kind of, she can't really blast double takedowns. Or at least
she's never really had to deal with a good kicker, in part because she's usually rushing out crazily, but there's a serious question of whether she'll do that same thing after having been disincentivized so strongly by Holly Holm.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, in general, it's a fight that you've got to think it's gonna almost, like, the first round, you're gonna know exactly if it's not over, you're gonna know exactly who's gonna win. The thing is that Rousey she's beaten great athletes, and she's beaten people from great gyms. And the first time she fought a good athlete, I don't really think Holm is a great athlete. She's just large and she's just like big and strong and
strong, but in terms of
well-trained,
explosive dynamicism, not so much.
Yeah, she's just very, very, very disciplined, I think. Yeah. And I think that the same is true of her boxing career as well. And I just don't think Rousey's ever fought a comparable athlete from an elite gym. And I think we now know that, it's no secret Glendale is not an elite gym. And
the weird thing about Ronda Rousey's, the little training clips we see that we all delight in sort of making fun of because it's so easy, it's really a low-hanging fruit to look at the weird things that happen in Rousey's training, is that everything looks overtrained in a weird way, where Ronda's really, really focused on popping the shoulder and turning the hand over as she punches.
The drill punch.
Right, to the point where it's completely unnatural looking. It looks like it's not a natural body movement. She's not comfortable doing it, and she doesn't really fight that way in a fight. It doesn't even show up when the punches actually start flying. I think she's a better natural boxer than she even really looks in the any of the Glendale camp footage.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think you mentioned this on Heavy Hands. I think she's gonna, if she gets into trouble, if Nunes starts landing counters on her, I think she'll blow her gas tank very quickly.
Yeah,
because it's a similar thing to, I think it's a similar thing, and I don't think it's a kind of, I don't think it's a coincidence that this is a grappling thing. It's a bit like Chael Sonnen or Tim Kennedy. If you saw him, like Tim Kennedy's last fight against Kelvin Gastelum, it's this kind of idea that I think this grapplers in particularly get this kind of grinder mentality where if you encounter adversity, you need to grind through it. You need to make sure you need to encounter it head on. And if you're still not having success, it's because you're not putting enough of yourself into it.
Yeah.
So it means that when there's a kind of hole there, when there's something which is going, consistently wrong, you end up kind of pouring everything of yourself into this. Like,
you end up kind of crushing yourself mentally too, because you keep running harder and harder into the same exact brick wall without changing your approach. You just do it with more ferocity, and you end up hurting yourself more because you get that sort of, if I can't knock them out with my best shot, will I ever knock them out? That kind of
and eventually the kind of the insecurity and the fact that you're blowing your gas, you're putting maximum effort into trying to do this stuff, and it kind of innately comes up against the fact that you have to try and do it, and I think nothing crushes you see nothing like crush the cardio of otherwise like well-trained athletes quite as much as that does, is when they're convinced that they have to do this but they just can't.
So rather than just Nunes as well.
I have to gotta go. And round 1 KO, I think.
There it is.
Maybe. Actually, give me round 1 KO.
Okay. There it is. So both of us like Nunes to retain the belt. Of course, when it comes to title fights, the habit for analysts and pundits alike tends to be picking the champion to retain. So, and who knows, Ronda Rousey could come out and surprise us. It's become, again, a little too easy to forget just how stellar Ronda Rousey was as a champion during her run. She's almost become kind of a joke to hardcore MMA fans, and she is still a solid fighter, and possibly still deserves to be called the greatest female mixed martial artist of all time. So it should be an interesting clash. Let's look at the odds before we close out the show. Ronda Rousey is favored. She started as a very heavy favorite, and that quickly changed. She was minus 320 back in October, and that has now come all the way down to minus 143. Amanda Nunes started as a sizable underdog, plus 240, but she is now just a slight favorite, a slight underdog rather, at plus 120. So more or less a pick'em fight, which is sort of how it feels to us here commentating. And that does it for this episode of the MMA Vivisection. Thank you very much, Phil, for filling in and joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
And, people can get at you on social media and find links to all of your fantastic work on both of us, of course, write for bloodyelbow.com. And Phil does some of my favorite, very sort of intellectual fight breakdowns, whether before or after. You do. I mean, it's not empty praise. So if you want to check out some really great fight writing that will make you think, check out Phil's stuff on Bloody Elbow. And you can also find him on Twitter at Evil Greg Jackson. I am, of course, at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. And subscribe to MMA Nation on YouTube. Go ahead and give this video a like. Share it with all your friends. You know the drill. Thank you guys for joining us, and enjoy the fights.